Dr. Ethan Cross had seen enough of war's aftermath during his 3 years providing medical care to refugee populations to understand that the physical wounds were often the least significant injuries that victims carried away from conflict zones. But the Etherian survivors on Kythera Prime had developed adaptations to trauma that challenged every framework he'd learned for helping people process the psychological damage that accompanied physical healing. The masks were the most obvious manifestation of their collective coping mechanism, elaborate constructions of silver and crystalline materials that covered the upper portions of their faces, leaving only lips and jawlines visible while concealing whatever damage the war had inflicted on features that were once considered the most beautiful in known space. Every Etherian wore one, from young children who had never known peacetime to elderly survivors whose masks had been refined and adjusted over years of hiding the evidence of chemical weapons, orbital bombardment, and the kind of systematic violence designed to destroy not just lives but the cultural identity that had defined their civilization. Dr. Cross, came a voice from behind him as he reviewed patient charts in the makeshift medical facility that served the largest refugee camp in this sector. The speaker was unmistakably Etherian. Her words carried the musical quality that made their language sound like poetry even when discussing practical matters, but her English was precise and unaccented in ways that suggested extensive education or diplomatic training. He turned to find a woman whose bearing immediately marked her as someone accustomed to authority, despite the refugee clothing and the elaborate silver mask that concealed her features from forehead to cheekbones. Her exposed lower face revealed lips that suggested both intelligence and something that might have been carefully controlled sadness, while her pointed ears, the one Etherian feature that masks couldn't conceal, moved with subtle expressions that he was learning to read as indicators of emotional state. "I'm Lyra," she continued, offering her hand in the standard human greeting while maintaining the kind of formal dignity that suggested someone playing a role rather than expressing natural personality. "I serve as cultural liaison between your medical teams and our people. We need to discuss treatment protocols that accommodate Etherian psychological requirements." Ethan shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and her skin carried the subtle luminescence that marked her species, though the patterns were muted in ways that suggested either illness or emotional suppression. "Dr. Ethan Cross. What kind of psychological requirements are we dealing with?" "Privacy needs related to facial exposure, traditional healing practices that complement but don't conflict with human medical procedures, and communication methods that allow patients to maintain dignity while receiving care from people outside their immediate cultural context." Lyra's explanation was thorough and professional, but Ethan caught undertones that suggested personal experience with the challenges she was describing. "The masks," Ethan said, recognizing that direct acknowledgement might be more respectful than avoiding obvious topics. "Are they religious requirements, cultural tradition, or psychological protection?" "All three," Lyra replied with what might have been appreciation for his directness. "Before the war, Etherians were known for physical beauty that represented our cultural values of harmony, artistic achievement, and spiritual refinement. The masks allow us to maintain social interaction while protecting others from seeing what violence has done to those ideals." "Protecting others, or protecting yourselves?" Lyra paused, her pointed ears shifting in ways that Ethan was beginning to recognize as indicators of complex emotional processing. "Perhaps both. When your appearance becomes evidence of everything brutal and destructive about circumstances beyond your control, covering that evidence becomes necessary for psychological survival." Over the following days, Ethan worked with Lyra to develop treatment protocols that respected Etherian cultural needs while providing effective medical care for injuries that ranged from recent trauma to old wounds that had never healed properly due to limited resources during active combat. Her knowledge of both human and Etherian medical practices proved invaluable, but more importantly, her obvious intelligence and dedication to helping her people created the foundation for professional respect that gradually evolved into personal interest. "Lyra," Ethan said during one of their planning sessions, "your medical knowledge is remarkably sophisticated. Were you trained as a healer before the war?" "I was trained in many things before the war," she replied with careful diplomacy that avoided specifics while confirming that her background included more than basic education. Etherian noble families emphasized comprehensive learning that prepared young people for various forms of public service. "Noble families?" Former noble families, Lyra corrected with a tone that indicated the subject carried painful associations. Most of the traditional leadership structure was eliminated during the early phases of the conflict. Those of us who survived learned to find other ways to serve our people. Ethan recognized the weight of loss that accompanied such casual references to eliminated leadership, but he also noted the way Lyra's commitment to refugee care seemed driven by personal obligation that went beyond professional duty or cultural expectation. "You chose to stay with the refugees rather than seeking asylum in safer territories," he observed. "I chose to stay with my people because leadership during crisis means sharing burdens rather than avoiding them," Lyra replied. "And because someone needs to help preserve what we can of Etherean culture while we adapt to realities that our traditions never anticipated." Their working relationship developed a rhythm that accommodated both Ethan's medical expertise and Lyra's cultural knowledge, with daily consultations that became increasingly comfortable as they learned to anticipate each other's concerns and communication styles. But Ethan found himself paying attention to details that went beyond professional assessment: the way Lyra's voice carried warmth when she spoke to frightened children, the patience she showed with elderly refugees whose traditional healing beliefs conflicted with modern medical procedures, and the obvious respect that other Etherians showed for her judgment and guidance. "Dr. Cross," said Maria Santos, his chief medical assistant, during one of their evening briefings, "I've noticed that you and Lyra have developed remarkable cooperation during treatment sessions. The Etherian patients seem much more receptive to care when she's involved in the process. She understands their cultural needs in ways that pure medical training can't provide," Ethan replied, though he recognized that his interest in Lyra's involvement went beyond her utility as cultural translator. "And you understand medical procedures in ways that respect those cultural needs instead of dismissing them as obstacles to efficient treatment," Maria observed with the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd noticed dynamics that extended beyond professional collaboration. That evening, as Ethan reviewed patient files in the quiet medical facility, he found himself thinking about Lyra's obvious intelligence, her commitment to helping others despite her own losses, and the graceful way she navigated between human medical protocols and Etherian cultural requirements. Her mask concealed her facial expressions, but her voice, her posture, and the subtle movements of her pointed ears had become familiar enough that he could read her emotional states with surprising accuracy. When she appeared in the medical facility's doorway, her silver mask catching the artificial lighting in ways that created interesting patterns but revealed nothing about the features it concealed, Ethan realized that his professional interest in her cultural knowledge had evolved into personal attraction to someone whose character and intelligence impressed him more than any physical appearance could have. "Working late again, Dr. Cross?" Lyra asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with the kind of comfortable familiarity that had developed during their weeks of collaboration. "Reviewing treatment outcomes and planning tomorrow's procedures," Ethan replied. "Though I have to admit, I'm also thinking about how much more effective our medical care has become since you started helping us understand Etherian psychological needs. And I've been thinking about how much more comfortable our people have become with human medical procedures since you started treating cultural requirements as medical necessities rather than inconvenient preferences," Lyra said. "Your approach demonstrates respect that most of us haven't experienced from outsiders since the war began." "Lyra," Ethan said, recognizing that their conversation was approaching territory that might affect their professional relationship, "I hope you understand that my interest in Etherian cultural practices extends beyond their medical utility." "Oh." Her pointed ears shifted in ways that suggested curiosity mixed with something that might have been cautious interest. "I find myself curious about the person whose knowledge and dedication have made our refugee care program so much more effective than standard protocols typically allow," Ethan said carefully. "And I hope that curiosity isn't inappropriate given our working relationship." Lyra was quiet for a moment, her mask preventing him from reading facial expressions that might have indicated her response to his admission. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of careful honesty that suggested she was sharing thoughts that she'd been considering for some time. "Dr. Cross, Ethan, your curiosity isn't inappropriate. But it might be complicated by realities that my current circumstances don't allow me to share openly." "Complicated how?" "Complicated by the difference between who I was before the war and who I've become since it began," Lyra replied. and by questions about whether personal interest can survive knowledge of what that transformation has actually involved. As they sat in the quiet medical facility, surrounded by equipment that helped heal bodies while being unable to address the deeper wounds that war had inflicted on identity and self-perception, Ethan began to understand that his growing attraction to Lyra would eventually require navigating challenges that went far beyond typical interspecies relationship considerations. 2 months into their collaboration at the refugee medical facility, Ethan discovered that Lyra's complicated circumstances included not just war trauma but a personal history that made her dedication to refugee care an act of profound moral courage rather than simple professional duty. The revelation came during a particularly difficult day when chemical weapon residue in the atmosphere had triggered respiratory crises among the Etherean population, requiring emergency treatment that pushed their limited medical resources beyond normal capacity. Dr. Cross, Lyra said during a brief break between emergency procedures, her voice carrying stress that her controlled posture couldn't completely conceal, "I need to inform you that some of our patients may recognize me despite my mask, and their reactions might complicate treatment protocols." "Recognize you how?" Ethan asked, noting the way her pointed ears had flattened against her head. A sign of distress that he'd learned to identify during their weeks of working together. "Before the war, my family held positions that made us visible in Etherean society. Public figures whose images were widely known before we learned that such visibility could become a liability during conflict." Lyra's explanation was carefully diplomatic, but Ethan caught implications that suggested her background involved more than minor nobility or local leadership. "What kind of positions?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, her masked face turned toward the medical bay where Etherean refugees were receiving treatment that might allow them to survive another day in circumstances that had already cost them everything they'd once considered essential to their identity as individuals and as a people. "My father was Crown Prince Theron Valandra. My mother was Princess Celeste of the Eastern Kingdoms. Was third in line for the Etherean throne until orbital bombardment eliminated the royal palace and everyone in it during the early phase of systematic leadership targeting." Her voice remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was sharing. "I survived because I was attending university on a distant world, studying interspecies diplomacy and cultural preservation methods." Ethan felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place as he realized that the woman whose cultural knowledge had proved so valuable was not just educated nobility but actual royalty whose decision to work with refugees represented a choice to serve rather than claim sanctuary with relatives who had evacuated to safer territories. "You're Princess Lyra," he said, understanding now why her bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority and why other Etherians looked to her for guidance that went beyond mere cultural translation. "I was Princess Lyra," she corrected. "Now I'm simply Lyra, a refugee like everyone else whose world was destroyed by people who decided that Etherean civilization was incompatible with their vision of galactic order. But you chose to return to Kythera Prime rather than accepting asylum elsewhere." "I chose to return because fleeing to safety while my people suffered would have made me complicit in my own culture's destruction," Lyra replied. "And because someone who understood both Etherean traditions and interspecies cooperation needed to help preserve what could be saved while adapting what needed to change for survival." Their conversation was interrupted by a patient crisis that required immediate attention, but as they worked together to provide emergency care that would keep respiratory distress from becoming fatal, Ethan found himself processing the implications of learning that his growing personal interest involved someone whose background included responsibilities and losses that went far beyond individual trauma. "Lyra," he said during their evening review of patient status reports, "when you mentioned that personal interest might be complicated by who you've become since the war began, were you referring to your royal background, or something else?" "Something else," she replied, her masked face turning toward the viewport that showed the scarred landscape of a world that had once been considered the most beautiful planet in this sector of space. "Royal background is simply social status that becomes irrelevant when your civilization is being systematically destroyed. The complication involves physical realities that war creates for people who survive situations that kill most others." Physical realities? Ethan, before the war, Etherians were known throughout the galaxy for beauty that represented our cultural ideals of harmony, artistic achievement, and spiritual refinement. My people valued physical appearance as expression of inner character, and our social structures reflected assumptions about the relationship between aesthetic beauty and moral worth. Lyra's voice carried the kind of careful control that suggested she was approaching topics that remained painful despite months or years of processing. Chemical weapons, shrapnel injuries, and surgical procedures performed under battlefield conditions don't accommodate those cultural values. Ethan began to understand that the masks worn by Etherian refugees concealed not just war injuries but damage to features that their culture had traditionally considered essential to personal identity and social worth. The masks protect others from seeing what violence has done to the aesthetic ideals that once defined your people's understanding of beauty and value, he said. The masks protect everyone, Lyra corrected. They allow us to maintain social interaction without forcing others to confront evidence of what systematic destruction looks like when applied to beings whose entire cultural identity was based on physical and artistic perfection. And you believe that seeing such evidence would change how people respond to you personally? I believe that most beings develop attraction based partly on physical appearance, and that war damage to faces that were once considered examples of ideal beauty creates challenges for personal relationships that extend beyond simple aesthetic preferences. Ethan studied Lyra's posture and the way her pointed ears expressed emotions that her concealed facial features couldn't convey, recognizing that her concerns about physical appearance reflected not vanity but realistic assessment of how appearance-based attraction might be affected by visible trauma. Lyra, he said carefully, my interest in you is based on your intelligence, your dedication to helping others despite your own losses, your cultural knowledge, and your obvious strength in navigating circumstances that would break most people. Your physical appearance, whatever it might be underneath the mask, isn't the foundation for attraction that I hope might develop into something more personal than professional cooperation. You say that now, she replied gently, but you've never seen what chemical weapons do to faces that were once considered beautiful enough to represent an entire species' aesthetic ideals on diplomatic occasions. And you've never given someone the chance to prove that their interest in you extends beyond physical appearance to include appreciation for character traits that war damage cannot affect, Ethan replied. Their conversation ended without resolution, but over the following weeks, Ethan found himself paying attention to moments when Lyra's mask seemed like a barrier not just to physical intimacy but to the kind of emotional connection that required complete honesty about fears, hopes, and the vulnerabilities that people shared when relationships moved beyond careful professional boundaries. Ethan, Lyra said one evening as they completed their review of medical supplies and patient care protocols, may I ask you something about human approaches to physical appearance and personal attraction? Of course. Do humans develop lasting emotional attachments based primarily on physical beauty, or do other factors become more important as relationships deepen over time? Ethan considered her question while studying the way her silver mask caught the facility's artificial lighting, creating patterns that were beautiful despite concealing rather than revealing the features beneath. Speaking personally rather than for all humans, he said, I've learned that initial attraction might include physical appearance, but lasting emotional attachment develops based on compatibility, shared values, and appreciation for someone's character and intelligence. Physical beauty can be appealing, but it's not sufficient for meaningful relationships, and its absence doesn't prevent deep emotional connection from developing. And if someone's appearance had been dramatically altered by circumstances beyond their control, then I'd hope they would trust me enough to let me prove that my feelings for them were based on who they are rather than how they look, Ethan replied. And I'd hope they would give me the chance to show them that some kinds of beauty transcend physical appearance entirely. Lyra's pointed ears shifted to positions that suggested hope mixed with uncertainty, and Ethan realized that their relationship was approaching decisions that would determine whether their professional partnership could evolve into something more intimate, or whether her fears about physical acceptance would prevent the kind of emotional vulnerability that deeper connection required. The bombing campaign that forced the entire refugee population into the ancient cave systems beneath Kythera Prime's surface created the kind of enforced intimacy that made privacy impossible and emotional barriers increasingly difficult to maintain. For 3 weeks, Ethan and Lyra worked together in underground medical stations carved from living rock, treating injuries and illnesses while surrounded by hundreds of refugees whose proximity made every conversation potentially public and every personal interaction subject to community observation. The cave environment is affecting respiratory function in ways that surface medical protocols don't address, Lyra observed during one of their daily consultations, her voice carrying the kind of professional focus that had helped them maintain working relationships despite the psychological pressure of extended underground confinement. Reduced air circulation, increased particulate matter from rock dust, and stress responses that compromise immune function, Ethan agreed, noting how the artificial lighting in their makeshift medical facility created interesting patterns in her silver mask while revealing nothing about the expression beneath. We'll need to adjust treatment approaches for patients whose conditions are being complicated by environmental factors we can't control. Their medical work had adapted to cave conditions with the kind of innovative problem-solving that characterized their best collaborative efforts, but Ethan found himself increasingly aware of Lyra's presence in ways that went beyond professional appreciation for her cultural knowledge and medical insights. The close quarters meant that he observed her interactions with refugee families, her patient translation of medical procedures for elderly Etherians whose traditional healing beliefs required careful integration with modern treatment, and her obvious leadership abilities that kept morale functional among people who had lost everything except their determination to survive another day. Lyra, Ethan said during one of their rare private moments in the medical supply area, I've been watching how the other refugees respond to you, and it's clear that your role here goes far beyond cultural liaison or medical translation. How do you mean? She asked, though her pointed ears suggested she understood the implications of his observation. I mean that they look to you for guidance that has nothing to do with medical procedures or communication with human staff. You're functioning as unofficial leadership for people who need someone to help them maintain hope and cultural identity under circumstances that seem designed to destroy both. Someone needs to help preserve what we can of Etherian traditions while adapting to realities that our culture never anticipated, Lyra replied. And someone needs to demonstrate that survival doesn't require abandoning everything that once made us who we were as a people. Even when demonstrating that survival requires personal sacrifices that most people wouldn't be willing to make. Lyra paused in her inventory of medical supplies, her masked face turning toward him with the kind of careful attention that indicated she was processing not just his words but the emotional undertones that accompanied them. Ethan, what sacrifices do you think I'm making that others wouldn't be willing to make? The sacrifice of accepting help from people outside your cultural context, the sacrifice of letting someone else share responsibility for your people's welfare, and the sacrifice of maintaining emotional distance from someone whose interest in you extends beyond professional collaboration. His admission carried honesty that felt both liberating and terrifying as he recognized that their extended time together had moved their relationship far beyond the careful boundaries they'd initially maintained. You're saying that you've developed personal feelings that go beyond appreciation for my work with refugee medical care. I'm saying that I've developed personal feelings for someone whose intelligence, strength, and dedication to helping others have made me want to know her as more than a professional colleague, Ethan replied. And I'm hoping that such feelings might be welcomed rather than creating complications that make our work together more difficult. The conversation was interrupted by a medical emergency that required immediate attention, but as they worked together to treat a child whose respiratory distress had become critical, Ethan noticed that Lyra's cooperation had acquired a different quality, still professionally competent, but with underlying awareness that their relationship was evolving beyond the careful boundaries that had previously defined their interaction. Ethan, Lyra said later that evening as they completed their patient review in the quiet medical area, I need to tell you something about Etherian cultural approaches to personal relationships that might help you understand why your expressed interest creates challenges beyond typical interspecies compatibility concerns. I'm listening. Etherian traditions emphasize physical appearance as expression of inner character, and our social structures assume that beings develop attraction based on aesthetic harmony between partners. Someone whose appearance has been damaged by war becomes problematic within those frameworks, not just for personal self-image but for cultural identity that was originally based on beauty and artistic achievement. But you're not living within traditional Etherian social structures anymore, Ethan pointed out. You're creating new frameworks for survival that accommodate realities your culture never anticipated. Couldn't those frameworks also accommodate new approaches to personal relationships? Theoretically, yes. But practically, changing cultural assumptions about appearance and attraction requires more than intellectual recognition that circumstances have made old standards inadequate. Lyra's voice carried the kind of careful honesty that suggested she was sharing thoughts that she'd been processing for some time. It requires trusting someone enough to discover whether their interest can survive knowledge of what war damage actually looks like. And you're not sure whether such trust would be justified in my case. I'm not sure whether such trust would be fair to you, Lyra corrected. Because once you've seen what chemical weapons do to faces that were once considered beautiful enough to represent an entire species on diplomatic occasions, there's no way to unsee that knowledge or return to attraction based on idealized assumptions. Ethan studied her posture and the way her pointed ears expressed emotions that her concealed features couldn't convey, recognizing that her concerns reflected not just personal insecurity but realistic assessment of how appearance-based attraction might be affected by confronting the visual reality of war trauma. Lyra, he said, moving closer with the kind of careful approach that respected her autonomy while indicating his serious intent, I understand that revealing your appearance involves risks that you've been protecting yourself from by maintaining the mask. But I also think you underestimate both the foundation for my interest in you and my capacity to appreciate beauty that transcends conventional aesthetic standards. You're asking me to trust you with vulnerabilities that I've been hiding from everyone, including myself, for months or years. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that someone might value you enough to prove that their feelings are based on who you are rather than how you look, Ethan replied. And I'm hoping that our weeks of working together have demonstrated character traits that justify taking such a risk. Lyra was quiet for several minutes, her silver mask reflecting the medical facility's lighting while concealing whatever emotional processing was occurring behind its protective barrier. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of careful decision-making that suggested someone choosing courage over caution despite realistic assessment of potential consequences. The bombing campaign above ground is expected to continue for several more days, she said. If you're serious about wanting to know me beyond professional collaboration, there might be opportunities for private conversation that cave conditions make possible despite the close quarters. I'm very serious about wanting to know you better, Ethan confirmed. And I'm hoping that such opportunities will allow us to discover whether what we've built as professional partners might develop into something more personal. Then perhaps, Lyra said, her pointed ears shifting to positions that suggested hope mixed with careful anticipation, we'll have the chance to find out whether your interest in me can survive complete honesty about what war has cost me personally. As they prepared for another night in the underground refuge that had become their temporary world, Ethan realized that their relationship was approaching the kind of emotional turning point that would either deepen their connection or reveal incompatibilities that professional collaboration had allowed them to avoid confronting. But looking at Lyra's graceful movements and the obvious intelligence behind her careful words, he found himself more certain than ever that whatever challenges complete honesty might present would be worth navigating for the possibility of building something meaningful with someone whose strength and character had already proven remarkable under circumstances that tested every assumption about survival, dignity, and what it meant to help others while processing one's own losses. 3 days after their conversation about trust and vulnerability, Lyra led Ethan to a section of the cave system that geological surveys had identified as stable but which refugee populations avoided due to its distance from the main settlement areas. The space was large enough for private conversation but small enough to feel intimate, with natural acoustic properties that would prevent their voices from carrying to other sections of the underground complex. Ethan, Lyra said as they settled into comfortable positions on the smooth rock formations that served as seating, I've been thinking about what you said regarding complete honesty and the risks involved in revealing vulnerabilities that I've been protecting for months. And, he asked, noting that her pointed ears were expressing complex emotions that her mask prevented him from reading through facial expressions. And I've decided that our relationship, professional and personal, has reached the point where continued concealment creates more barriers than protection. Her voice carried the kind of careful decision-making that suggested someone choosing courage despite realistic fears about potential consequences. But before I show you what the war has done to my appearance, I need you to understand something about Etherian cultural values and what it means for someone from my background to make this choice. I'm listening. Before the war, I was considered an example of ideal Etherian beauty, features that were used in diplomatic contexts to represent our species' aesthetic achievements, bone structure that artists used as models for sculptures that decorated public spaces, coloring that poets wrote about as expression of natural harmony. Lyra's words carried the weight of identity that had been shattered by circumstances beyond her control. When humans or other species thought about Etherian appearance, images like mine were what they imagined. Ethan processed this information while studying her posture and the way her silver mask seemed to both protect and isolate her from the emotional connection that their conversation was approaching. "You're telling me that revealing your current appearance means showing me the difference between what Etherian beauty was supposed to represent and what war has done to those ideals," he said. "I'm telling you that once you see my face, you'll understand why I chose to work with refugees rather than claiming asylum with relatives who escaped the conflict," she replied. "And why the idea of personal relationships feels complicated by realities that go beyond typical concerns about physical attraction." "Lyra," Ethan said, moving closer with the kind of careful approach that respected her autonomy while indicating his serious intent, "whatever the war has done to your appearance, it hasn't changed the intelligence, strength, and compassion that have made me want to know you as more than a professional colleague." "You say that now," she said gently, "but you've never seen what chemical weapons do to faces that were once used to represent an entire species' understanding of beauty and cultural achievement." "Then show me," Ethan replied, his voice carrying the kind of steady confidence that had developed during their weeks of working together through challenges that tested both their professional capabilities and personal resilience. "Show me what you're afraid will change my feelings for you, and let me prove that attraction based on who you are runs deeper than any physical changes that circumstances beyond your control have created." Lyra was very still for several minutes, her breathing the only sound in the quiet cave chamber as she processed the magnitude of what he was asking and what she was considering. When she finally moved, it was with the deliberate grace that had characterized all her actions since he'd known her, but now carried the weight of someone crossing a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. "Ethan," she said, her hands moving to the latches of her silver mask, "I need you to understand that what you're about to see represents not just my personal trauma, but the systematic destruction of everything my culture once valued about beauty, harmony, and the relationship between physical appearance and spiritual worth." "I understand," he replied, though he realized that understanding the concept and experiencing the reality would prove to be very different things. Her fingers moved with careful precision as she released the intricate mechanisms that had kept her face hidden for months, and Ethan found himself holding his breath as the mask came away to reveal features that told the story of survival through violence that had been designed to destroy more than just lives. The scars were extensive, chemical burns that had transformed the left side of her face into patterns of raised tissue that spoke to pain beyond anything he'd encountered in his medical training, shrapnel damage that had required surgical reconstruction under battlefield conditions where aesthetics had been secondary to basic function, and tissue grafts that had healed with the kind of permanent irregularity that marked emergency treatment during active combat. But what struck Ethan most powerfully wasn't the damage itself, but the way Lyra's eyes, pale green and completely undamaged, held his gaze with the kind of vulnerable courage that asked the question she couldn't bring herself to voice. "Can you still want me like this?" she whispered, her voice carrying all the fear and hope that her mask had concealed during their months of working together. Ethan's response was not words but action. He moved closer, raising his hands to frame her face with the kind of gentle reverence that acknowledged both her courage in showing him and his recognition that the scars were part of her story rather than flaws that diminished her worth. "Lyra," he said, his thumbs tracing the edges of healed tissue with careful tenderness, "you are still the most beautiful woman I've ever known. These scars don't change that, they tell the story of someone who survived experiences that would have broken most people, and who chose to use that survival to help others rather than seeking safety for herself." Her eyes filled with tears that she'd probably been holding back for months or years, and when he leaned forward to kiss her, first her forehead, then her cheeks where the scars were deepest, then finally her lips with the kind of gentle passion that spoke to attraction that transcended any physical considerations, she responded with the emotional intensity of someone who had thought such acceptance was impossible. "I was afraid," she whispered against his lips, "that no one would ever be able to look at me and see anything other than what war had taken away." "I look at you and see everything the war couldn't touch," Ethan replied. "Your intelligence, your strength, your dedication to helping others, your courage in choosing to trust me with something you've been hiding from everyone else. The war changed your appearance, but it couldn't change who you are." Their embrace deepened into the kind of physical intimacy that had been impossible while emotional barriers remained between them, and Ethan discovered that loving someone meant accepting not just their current reality but the experiences that had shaped them into the person worthy of that love. "Ethan," Lyra said as they held each other in the quiet cave chamber, "what happens now? Do we continue our medical work as partners, pretending this conversation never happened, or do we find ways to build something together that acknowledges what we've just shared?" "We build something together," he said without hesitation. "We continue helping refugees while learning what it means to be partners in every sense of the word. And you stop hiding behind masks that make you think your worth depends on concealing evidence of survival." "That might take time," she admitted. "Years of believing that my appearance represents failure and loss don't disappear just because someone proves they can accept what I look like now." "Then we take whatever time you need," Ethan replied. "And we help each other understand that beauty comes in many forms, including the kind that develops when people choose courage and compassion despite experiencing circumstances that could have made them bitter or broken." Over the following weeks, as the bombing campaign ended and refugee populations began returning to surface settlements, Lyra gradually reduced her reliance on the mask that had protected her from confronting others' reactions to her appearance. The process wasn't linear. Some days she felt confident enough to work with patients face to face, while others required the psychological protection that concealment provided. But Ethan's consistent acceptance and obvious attraction helped her begin to see herself through his eyes rather than through cultural standards that made her scars seem like failures. "Dr. Cross," said Colonel Martinez during one of his periodic inspections of the medical facility, "I've noticed that your treatment protocols have achieved remarkable success rates with the Etherean refugee population. What do you attribute that success to?" "Partnership with someone who understands that healing involves more than just medical procedures," Ethan replied, looking at Lyra, whose uncovered face had become a symbol of resilience rather than damage for many of the refugees who worked with her. "And recognition that beauty and worth aren't diminished by surviving circumstances that test every assumption about what it means to maintain dignity and hope." 6 months later, their medical facility had become a model for refugee care that other organizations throughout the sector were studying and implementing. But more importantly for Ethan and Lyra, their partnership had proven that the strongest relationships developed when people were brave enough to share their wounds as well as their strengths. "Any regrets about asking me to remove the mask?" Lyra asked one evening as they completed their patient rounds, her scarred but expressive face bright with the kind of confidence that came from being valued for who she was rather than how she looked. "My only regret," Ethan replied, "is that it took so long for you to trust me enough to let me prove that my feelings for you were based on everything the mask couldn't conceal: your intelligence, your strength, your compassion, and your courage in choosing to help others heal from the same traumas that marked your own life." "And my only regret," Lyra said, "is that I spent so much time believing that survival meant hiding evidence of what I'd endured, instead of understanding that the most beautiful thing about any of us is the way we choose to help others despite carrying our own scars." Their love had indeed proven that true beauty transcended physical appearance, and that the most meaningful relationships were built by people courageous enough to show each other their wounds while working together to heal a world that had tried to convince them they were broken beyond repair.